and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Shona Lindsay, and as ever I'm joined by three experts here in the studio. Let me first introduce you to Tony Gimple, who is the founder of Less Tax for Landlords. And next to Paul Mahoney, who is the Managing Director of Nova Financial Group.
Hello.
Hi. And finally to Simon Zutshi, author of international bestseller Property Magic and founder of the Property Investors Network. We've got loads to get through, so I'll crack on first of all with a question for you, Tony, if I may. When is it right to buy and hold buy-to-let property in a limited company?
The short answer is if you don't need the income, don't have any children, don't care about inheritance tax, then it might be a good idea to buy and hold property in a limited company.
Because?
Because you're going to get taxed 40 ways from Sunday by doing it. Overall, it's a much more expensive option. Mortgage rates can be higher, less consumer protection, less choice of lenders. A lot of lenders will put a charge, a debenture on your balance sheet, which means you can't really use your director's loan account or much else without their consent. And then how are you going to get the money out? Yes, you've got lower headline rates of corporation tax, 19%, falling to 17%. But then you've got income tax, national insurance, employers, national insurance contributions, auto enrolment. You've got director's loan account tax, capital gains tax if you take the money out and put it in your pocket. And then finally, because it's an investment company, it's going to be fully subject to 40% inheritance tax.
Right.
So it only works if you're never going to need the income and don't mind your estate paying 40p in the pound thereafter when you eventually fall off your perch.
Which kind of makes it sound as though it's not any good for anyone, really. So who would want to use something like that?
I have no idea, frankly. Over the last 3 years, we've probably talked to the thick end of 4,000 people. And as yet, we haven't found one who owning buy-to-let properties in a limited company makes a great deal of commercial sense. Right. If, however, you're trading in properties, developing, flipping, then it can work out. But then you're operating just a normal business as opposed to being a buy-to-let business. But the same things occur. How do you get the money out? The prime reason for using limited companies is risk management, limited liability, particularly if you're involved with third parties over whom you have no control or no control of their lives. So it is a good way of reducing risk. But from a purely practical, from a tax perspective, once it's in, very, very difficult to get the money out. It's also a one-way street, particularly if you've got an existing portfolio and trying to move it in. Once it's in, it's in. Very difficult to get it out, and it'll be a great cost thereafter.
Right. Gosh, that's really interesting. So did this all sort of come about because of the new taxation laws with buy-to-let? Did people start to look at limited companies to see whether that was a better way of not paying as much tax and losing the mortgage relief?
In effect, but it's a classic knee-jerk reaction.
Right.
At the moment, limited companies are not subject to Section 24, the restriction of mortgage interest relief. That's going to be short-lived. The Exchequer is losing a hell of a lot of money because people are moving into limited companies. The talk within the trade is that this budget or the one after or a future Chancellor, probably post-2021, will no longer allow finance costs to be deducted for tax purposes within limited companies.
Right.
And it'd be very easy for them to raise corporation tax for businesses that own buy-to-let properties within limited companies.
So any small window of opportunity you think is going to go anyway?
Correct.
Just to comment on that, in the final quarter of last year, over 70% of new buy-to-let mortgage applications were for limited companies. So it is nearly 3/4 of the new purchase market.
Right.
A lot of the points that Tony mentioned there that are downsides to limited companies also apply to the individual, regardless of whether it's in a limited company or not.
Yeah.
So, there are some downsides, but to say that it's just not applicable and you should just not think about it, I don't think is right. You should seek advice on what the best way of doing it is
For your circumstances.
For your personal circumstances, yeah. Because it's depending on your circumstances, the right way of structuring things can be very different.
Yes, of course. Okay, thank you, gentlemen, for both of your input there. I have got a question directly for you, Paul, though, if I may. This is a person who has just inherited and sold a small house. They've decided to move into a bigger family home and still have some funds left. So we're thinking of using those funds to get a buy-to-let property. What do they need to consider in the financing of a new buy-to-let?
Okay. So from a finance perspective, that's what they've asked, so I'll focus on that. There's been some recent changes around the way that lenders look at buy-to-let mortgage, or the way they have to look at buy-to-let mortgages. Right. That is with regards to benchmark rates. So all buy-to-let lenders now need to use a benchmark rate of 5.5%, and that needs to cover costs 125% of the time. So that gives some leeway on extra costs and vacancy periods and things. Some lenders have gone a little bit further than that and made it 145% of the time. But it's important to understand, therefore, based upon what you're buying, what the yield is going to be and what that will allow you to borrow. Because that change is obviously with regards to serviceability, but that can also affect the loan to value that you're able to achieve on the property. If it's a lower yielding, higher value property, quite often you won't be able to borrow the full 75% that you may have been able to borrow before that change. Right. And that mostly affects, as I say, higher value, low yield, or if you want to look at geographically, London and the southeast. Whereas most other areas where the yields are a bit higher aren't too much affected by that because they have more of a sort of profit buffer, if you like, or a higher yield. So that's one major thing to consider. How much are you going to actually be able to borrow? In relation to what you're buying, and that will depend on what they're looking at, I suppose, and what they're looking to achieve from it. Obviously, they need to understand their options. I think where a lot of people go wrong when it comes to buy-to-let mortgages, they just go down and speak to their local bank or the bank they've used for 20 years, and that lender will say no, or they'll say, here's what we do. But that's probably only one of over 1,000 products that are available in the market, and there could be a range of other products that are far more suitable to what they're looking to do. So my advice would be to seek independent advice, get an understanding of the full market. Another thing to consider is about half of the products in the market are only available to intermediaries.
Right.
So you're only even if you do go and speak with the 60 lenders in the market yourself, which you won't.
There's still an awful lot missing that you can't.
You could spend a whole year doing that, and you still only get access to half the products.
Right.
So spend a day speaking to an advisor instead. And they then should give you more of an understanding of anything I haven't just covered of what you need to consider in relation to your personal situation.
Great, okay. So the thing that you were talking about earlier, is that what people are starting to now call stress testing?
Correct.
So, and that will change from area to area, mainly because of the cost of different properties. So if we're in the south...
so it will change geographically, mainly because areas work on similar values and similar yields.
Yes.
But that isn't necessarily linear, because some properties will be much higher yielding than others. For example, a cheaper one-bedroom apartment will usually have a higher yield than a six-bedroom house, for example.
But then you might not have the capital growth on that property.
Correct. Yeah. So there's two considerations, but if we're just looking at it from a finance perspective, that's the very important thing for them to keep in mind. Yes. How much they're going to be able to borrow, because that will also affect the returns on the funds they're investing. If they have £100,000, for example, to invest, and they want to buy a £400,000 property or two £200,000 properties, then they're going to need the full 75% loan to value. Yes. And in my view, one of the major benefits of investing in property is the leverage. The fact that you can borrow fairly cheaply over the long term with high loan to values, that's what makes property an attractive investment. Property as a cash buy isn't that sexy. It's okay, but it doesn't give it that great of a return as a cash buy. It's the ability to quadruple your money with the leverage that gives you quite a good return on your cash without necessarily having to set the world on fire on the actual asset.
Okay, great. Sorry.
And also with the stress testing, lenders are now obliged to have a look at the impact of Section 24, particularly where you're a higher rate taxpayer and are having to make payments on account. That can severely affect your ability.
Gosh, that's really interesting. Because so they're actually looking at what you might have to outlay earlier, and that would then affect I see the gosh. That I don't think that's something that I wouldn't have ever thought about. So it's really interesting that you bring that up.
It's really trying times for the accidental landlord.
Yeah.
And what anybody should do, either in property or seeking to get into a property, almost forget that it is property for a second and just treat it like any other business. And if you're going along to a bank or other lender wanting to borrow money, they will want your inside leg measurement, experience, business plan, how you're going to service the debt, what the tax position is. So if you treat it in exactly the same way, you're not going to have a problem. How you finally structure it in your own name, via partnership, via mixed partnerships, via limited companies, that's the bit you've really got to take joined up advice. And bear in mind that mortgage brokers, financial advisors typically are neither authorised nor indemnified
To talk
give
about
that.
tax.
Correct.
Yeah. Great. So seek independent advice from lots of different
At the same
avenues
time.
at the same time.
It's really important that everyone talks together.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to get disjointed advice.
Brilliant. Thank you, gentlemen. Simon, a question for you. Does anyone know if this would count as one household or two for HMO licensing purposes? I've emailed the council, but they typically take a few days to respond. I think that's pretty quick, actually. So I was hoping someone might know. I'm letting my terraced house to 4 people on one single AST. They are 2 cohabiting couples, 1 married couple and 1 living together couple. Couple 1, Mr. A and Ms. B. Couple 2, Mr. C and Ms. D. Mr. A and Ms. D are first cousins. Would this be one household or two? And also, what could I ask them to prove that they are indeed related?
That's quite a complicated question.
Really complicated question.
Thanks for saving that one.
Sorry.
So, a couple of things. First of all, I guess what are they? I don't really understand what this viewer is actually trying to achieve by the question, and I think they're maybe trying to say, is this potentially a house of multiple occupation?
Yeah.
The definition of that is 3 unrelated people living in the same property. So therefore, if the 2 people who are potentially related, you could say that didn't really count, but that's one unit. And if there's 2 others, so I think that's still probably technically is an HMO. Although it's on one contract, that doesn't really know. It's about the number of people living in the property. So I think that's what they're trying to get at. So fine to have a one contract, that's no problem at all. What I would say is, though, I think it's probably worth checking with the local council to see how that particular council qualifies a licensable HMO. For most councils, it's 5 or more people. So in this case, it wouldn't be licensable. But some councils have 3 or more unrelated people, so it might need a licence depending on the location. That's one thing. Yes. And then secondly, it certainly would need the safety requirements for an HMO, so it should have interlinked smoke alarms in all the rooms. So if there's a problem, everyone's notified. You know, safety is the most important criterion in a rental property.
When you say interlinked, is that mains operated?
Yes. Yes, you have a control panel. They're all interlinked, wide into the mains. So if something happens, the whole alarm goes off in every room and everyone's got time to get out of the property. Really, really important. And I think those are the main considerations, really. If it needs an HMO licence, you need to have all the fire doors and all the other regs. You know, it's probably worth still having a fire door between the kitchen and the living room, because that's where most fires might start, and a heat detector in the kitchen as well, again, to signal any issues that might arise from the property. It's really, really important to make sure we do everything we possibly can to protect tenants in the property. Yeah. So I think that's what the question was getting at, and I hope
yes,
that's answered.
we think it's.
We think it probably is, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for this half of Property Question Time. Do join us after the break, and we'll have lots more questions that our experts will answer for you. Welcome back to Property Question Time. I'm Shona Lindsay, and just a reminder of who we have here today in the studio. Tony Gimple, Paul Mahoney, and Simon Zutshi. Welcome back, gentlemen. So let's crack on with the next round of questions for you, Tony. My accountant has just told me that my tax bill is going to increase in January, and that I'm going to have to pay 50% of next year's tax bill, which is also increasing in advance. What can I do? You kind of touched on this in the first half.
I did, yeah.
Didn't you?
I suppose it's the follow-on question in some ways. Paying tax in advance is a real killer. HMRC will assume that because you earn money this year, you're going to at least earn the same next year, which is not unreasonable. And because, generally speaking, the government doesn't like the self-employed, because it's opaque for tax purposes, they're going to want to take some money on account, and you'll be paying tax in January and July. Don't let the tax tail wag the planning dog when it comes to business. You know, work out what your goals are and how best to achieve them, and then look at how to maximise the commercial benefits. Paying tax in advance, we're seeing that by the time we get to June 19, around about the time I'm 60, which is a really sobering thought, horrible, some people will be paying more tax than their profit in that year. And that is going to have significant issues, not just for them, but for their tenants, for their lenders, and for the economy as a whole. And it's just yet another example of short-sighted, knee-jerk policies causing a bigger problem than they're designed to solve. So I think you just got to accept the fact that if you're making money, and you only pay tax if you're making money, and why would you want to lose money in business? It seems to defeat the object. You're going to have to start making better provision, look at how your investments are performing, looking at how the business is performing, and very, very importantly, look at how you can have proper, legitimate business structures which help you to still achieve your goals, but reduce the need to pay so much tax in advance every year. And if you're borrowing money, as we discussed earlier, lenders got to take that into account.
Yes.
And it can have dire consequences across the board.
Well, it could be a massive amount of money which you suddenly don't have access to.
Correct. And you won't be able to borrow it either.
No. And in terms of claiming it back, is that relatively easy for a self-employed landlord to do if they don't make the same money the following year?
It will catch up with itself eventually, but they're really going to have to seek advice from property accounting and property tax specialists. The average GP high street accountant won't know how to do it.
Right.
Because it,
very specialist
it
one.
is a specialist area. Yes.
Okay.
It's going to cause a real issue because out of the 1.75 million landlords, I'd put money on the fact that at least 1 million really don't understand the implications of this. So when January 2019 comes, it's going to be a massive shock. And that's going to have a knock-on effect on the whole market. I think lots of landlords might think about retiring, selling up early, getting rid of their properties. So this government policy is going to have a huge impact on the economy as a whole, much bigger than I think they've anticipated.
2019 is going to be a big year then, isn't it?
It's going to be very an opportunity for those people who know what they're doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
But most people are going to get slaughtered.
Yeah, which is also why when Paul said that 75% mortgages are via limited companies.
Yes.
It's because people see that as the obvious and easy option. It may reduce tax today, but it has a massive tail later on.
And what all of the change, not just with regards to Section 24, but the finance changes I mentioned before, they are placing a lot more importance on yield. The sort of age-old strategy of buying property just breaking even for growth doesn't really work anymore, because that strategy could quite easily become negatively geared. You're actually losing money on a yearly basis. Whereas if you have a decent yield and a decent profit buffer,
That's the Warren Buffett.
these changes don't hurt you anywhere near as much.
Right.
If you
But
can
if
pay a
you're
little bit of
near to
extra
the
tax,
mark.
if you can still borrow the same amount as you can before, you're still making money. And hopefully you're making some growth as well, so you're still in the market and you're still doing well. It's for those that are, borderline from a yield perspective that are going to really struggle.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. So, Paul, a direct question for you now. I want to understand the buy-to-let market, don't we all? And what is involved in being a landlord. Can you please advise me on the following topics? Buy-to-let deposit and mortgage requirement, letting agents' fees and contracts, and what letting agents will do, the EPC and safety inspections.
It's quite a broad question.
It is.
We could talk about that all day.
Yeah.
You could probably spend all year learning about each of those points. But I'll cover them in brief. So firstly, they asked about deposits. Deposits and
Deposits and mortgage requirements.
So for a buy-to-let, the average maximum that I like to call it is 75%. And what I mean by that is that's where most lenders will lend you up to and still at a pretty decent interest rate. As soon as you go above that, the rates start to hike quite a bit. And I would generally say for most people, you are better off going at about that rate than anything less, because it just better utilises your money. So that's sort of loan to values. Requirements, buy-to-let mortgages are quite different to residential mortgages in that it's a lot more about the property that you're buying and the yield that property will provide
than the individual's income.
So, for example, some buy-to-let lenders will almost ignore the individual. Some lenders don't even require you to have any income. Most that will do that would require you to already have a property or be an experienced landlord. So it varies again depending on your situation. If you're a first-time buyer, first-time landlord, it's going to be most restrictive. And then thereafter, once you have a home, it becomes a little bit less. Once you have a buy-to-let for more than 6 months, it becomes a little bit less. And once you're an experienced landlord, there's a lot of flexibility in the buy-to-let lending market. So it differs between lenders and it also differs between your situation. Again, another very good reason to seek advice based upon where you're currently at to determine what your options are and what the requirements are in that area.
Right.
With regards to property management, was that the next point?
Letting agents' fees and their contract and what they do.
So again, they differ substantially. The fees differ quite a lot. London is expensive generally. I've seen property management and lettings fees be in excess of 20% in London, whereas outside of London, you're probably looking at an average of less than 10%. Some are charging even less than that, in the single figures now. I think that's a market that's changing quite a lot at the moment. There's been a huge, I think people are realising that actually you don't need to charge 15 or 20% to manage a property, and that the margins there have probably been too fat. And now there's some entering the market that are charging like 4 or 5%.
So do you think that's because a lot of people are actually managing their own properties and thinking, well, I'm not going to pay that?
I think perhaps there's been a realisation that there isn't the cost doesn't justify the benefit. And there's some more budget people entering the market, which maybe don't do the same extent of services, but are a lot cheaper. So there's a range is the answer, and it does somewhat depend on where the property is, as to what you would expect to pay.
And what you'd get for that.
And what you'd get. There's obviously full lettings and management, so they let the property for you and they manage the property. There's just lettings and there's just management. And obviously, if you're just using lettings, then you'd have to manage it yourself. If you're just using management, then you'd have to let it yourself. And the costs will differ depending on what they're including there.
And then just quickly, they asked about EPC and safety inspections. We've kind of talked about some of that a little bit with the integrated fire. So what do they need to do in terms of getting an EPC?
So they obviously have to have them in place. If they're buying new properties, they'll usually come with those things initially, and then they need to renew them when required. Again, it will somewhat depend on the type of property that they're buying as to what
EPC every 10 years, is that right? Or am I making that up?
I think it's 10 years, yeah.
But
if you're selling or renting,
safety inspections, that's every year. What about something like the integrated fire thing? Is that
you should get those really tested every week. Someone should check that it works.
So even if it's the tenant.
Well, you'd have a responsible person checking every week.
Okay, right. So there is quite a lot.
There's a lot to learn there, and it will depend, on the property you're buying, the council area that you're in, what requirements are in relation to that property. So obviously first determine what you're buying, and then determine what the requirements might be. Probably a bit too much to cover there in one question.
Or a whole week's worth of episodes.
And just very quickly going back to the price versus value.
Yes.
The percentage to a large degree is immaterial, because what you have to do is balance that out against what your time cost is.
Yes.
And work out how many hours it will take you to achieve the same. And if you can achieve more by paying somebody else, then almost regardless of what the percentage is, it makes sense to let them do it, and you earn more money.
Doing whatever else you do.
Correct. So that's a value as opposed to a fixed
and that
point.
goes back to talking about it as being a business and not getting emotionally involved, actually categorising where the money comes from.
And make sure you've got a proper contract. So promise what you deliver what you promise, and make sure they do exactly the same thing to boot.
Brilliant. Thank you, gentlemen. Right, final question of this episode for you, Simon. Could you please explain a little how crowdsourcing helps in the property business?
It's a really interesting question now. I wonder if they actually mean crowdsourcing. Because when
Yes.
I think about crowdsourcing is a way of going out to the crowd, so a number of people, to pool resources. So, for example, sometimes people will write a book and they'll go out and get different people to write different chapters, or they might have a technical project and they look for different contractors to come and help them. So I guess one thing you could maybe do is you could, if you're doing a small development project, you could go out and you could crowdsource the team to come and help you. But that's about as far as I would see that would really stretch it in that particular environment. I wonder if they're talking about crowdfunding instead, because a lot of this terminology, crowdfunding, peer-to-peer, is all very, very new for the average person. And so I think a lot of people do get terminology confused. Crowdfunding is where someone might have a property project that's been found, put onto a platform, and then some people will come and say, yeah, I'd like to support that project, and they effectively buy into that project, get some equity in return for cash funding it. And that's different again from peer-to-peer lending, when someone might have a property and they will borrow money from the crowd who help fund that project in return for an interest rate. And it's a fixed return they get on that, usually a shorter period of time. So again, it's about trying to work out the right terminology. I think when you're investing in property, it's a good lesson to make sure you understand terminology, because you might be speaking to someone about something and you both have a different interpretation of what that actually means.
And you're going to get a different answer.
Exactly. So always clarify exactly what someone means when they ask you a question like that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you,
you.
gentlemen. Well, that's all we've got time for this episode of Property Question Time. But as ever, if you have any questions to pose to our experts, please do log on to the website www.property-tv.co.uk or send us a direct email on info@propertytelevision.co.uk. Thank you so much to our wonderful guests, to Tony Gimple, Paul Mahoney, and Simon Zutshi.
Thank you.
I'm Shona Lindsay, and we'll see you very soon. Thanks. Bye.